12 episodes. That is all it took for a British sitcom about a miserable hotelier to burrow itself permanently into the culture. No lengthy run, no dozens of seasons, just a dozen tightly wound half-hours of shouting, slamming doors, and social humiliation. And yet within those 12 episodes sits a single scene so explosive, so endlessly argued over, that it still gets pulled apart by critics, comedians, and offended viewers alike. People ask how a show this short, this beloved, and this celebrated could also be the center of one of British television's longest-running controversies. The answer lives inside one hotel lobby, one concussed manager, and 4 words that have outlived almost everything else from that era of comedy. Before we get to that infamous scene, it helps to understand where all this madness actually began, because the truth is stranger than anything a comedy writer could invent from scratch. Long before there was a fictional establishment called Fawlty Towers, there was a real one, and it was every bit as chaotic as the show that followed. A group of comedians best known for their work on a wildly experimental sketch show had booked rooms at a modest seaside hotel while filming nearby. What greeted them was not hospitality in any recognizable sense. The man running the place treated every guest interaction as a potential threat. He second-guessed motives, snapped at minor mistakes, and generally behaved as though customer service were a personal insult rather than a job description. The stories that emerged from that stay sound almost too absurd to be real. A guest set his briefcase down for a moment in the lobby, and rather than simply asking whose it was, the manager assumed the worst and hurled it over a garden wall, convinced it might be dangerous. When one of the visiting performers used his cutlery in a manner the manager personally disapproved of, he was publicly corrected as though he had committed some grave offense. Complaints were met not with apology, but with irritation, as if the guests themselves were the problem for having the audacity to expect basic comfort. For most people, an experience like that would simply end in a scathing review and a vow never to return. For one particular member of that comedy troupe, it became something else entirely. Material. He watched this man's paranoid, prickly, wildly inappropriate behavior with a mixture of disbelief and fascination. There was something almost theatrical about how wrong this hotelier was for his own profession, and that contradiction, a man who despised the very guests he depended on, stuck with him long after the crew packed up and left town. Years later, that comedian, working alongside his then-wife and creative partner, transformed those memories into a character who would become one of the most recognizable figures in British comedy. The exaggerated tantrums, the barely contained fury, the constant scheming to appear more refined than he actually was. All of it grew out of watching a real innkeeper completely fail at the one job he had chosen for himself. The writers heightened everything for effect, but the essential DNA, the suspicion, the social clumsiness, the talent for offending absolutely everyone in the room, came directly from life. Ironically, the real hotelier who inspired all of this apparently never realized the connection. He lived out his years without any indication that his catastrophic approach to hospitality had been immortalized on national television. It is a strange kind of legacy. A man remembered not for anything he intended to be remembered for, but for accidentally becoming the blueprint of one of comedy's great disasters. To understand why this particular writer was so perfectly positioned to turn a bad hotel stay into television history, it helps to look at where he came from. He grew up the only child in a modest seaside household, raised by a father who had once altered the family surname because he found the original version embarrassingly close to a dairy product. That small act of reinvention seems almost fitting in hindsight, considering how much of his son's later career would be built on turning discomfort into performance. As a child, he was unusually tall for his age, already towering over classmates by the time he reached his early teenage years. That height made him stand out long before his sense of humor did, and by his own accounts, he spent a good portion of his school years observing the people around him rather than fitting seamlessly among them. That habit of quiet observation, watching how people behaved when they thought no one was paying close attention, would later become one of his defining strengths as a comedy writer. School life gave him plenty of formative moments, some funny, some painful. He pulled at least one memorable prank involving painted footprints leading away from a war memorial statue, a small piece of visual mischief that hinted at the kind of dry, absurdist humor he would later build a career on. But not every experience was lighthearted. Being passed over for a leadership position, despite strong academic performance, left a lasting impression on him, shaping the skeptical eye he would later turn toward authority figures, institutions, and anyone who took themselves a little too seriously. Due to circumstances beyond his control, involving university admissions at the time, his path to higher education was delayed, and he ended up returning to his old school not as a student, but as a teacher, covering subjects ranging from classical language to the sciences. It is a small but delightful irony that lessons he once taught in a classroom would resurface decades later in one of his most famous film roles, where his character humorously corrects grammatically incorrect graffiti. When he finally arrived at university to study law, fate intervened in the form of a student club looking for new talent. Asked whether he could sing or dance, he bluntly admitted he could do neither particularly well, but offered instead that he could make people laugh. That simple exchange opened the door to a university comedy society, where he met several future collaborators, including one partnership that would prove especially significant to the trajectory of his career. Even after graduating with a proper law degree, his father kept sending him newspaper clippings for retail management positions, just in case the comedy business did not pan out. It did. Before the hotel show ever existed, this writer had already made a name for himself as part of a groundbreaking sketch comedy team, one known for surreal, boundary-pushing humor that reshaped what television comedy could look like. But it was his marriage to a talented actress and writer that ultimately gave shape to the project that would define his legacy. Together, the couple took that unforgettable hotel experience from years earlier and shaped it into something entirely new. A fictional hotel run by a man teetering constantly on the edge of a breakdown, surrounded by a sharp-tongued wife, a sensible maid, and a well-meaning but perpetually confused foreign waiter. When the show first premiered, critical reception was lukewarm at best. Reviewers struggled to make sense of its frantic pacing and heightened absurdity, with at least one prominent critic dismissing it outright as a mess. Audiences, however, responded very differently. They recognized something true in the chaos, a kind of comedic honesty buried beneath the shouting and slapstick. Viewers connected instantly with the lead character's simmering rage and constant humiliation, alongside the sharp wit of his wife, the calm competence of the maid, and the lovable confusion of the waiter who never quite understood what was happening around him. What made the show extraordinary was not simply the chaos itself, but the astonishing precision behind it. Every mistaken identity, every collapsing lie, every disastrous dinner service was constructed with the kind of tight comedic architecture more commonly associated with stage farce than television. Nothing was accidental. The show's writers treated each half-hour episode like a ticking clock, winding tension tighter and tighter until it inevitably burst. Despite the eventual acclaim, the show's survival was never guaranteed. After its first batch of episodes aired, network executives seriously considered not continuing the series at all. It took repeated broadcasts and steadily growing word of mouth to convince decision-makers that this strange little show about an unbearable hotelier deserved a second chance. Years passed before a second and ultimately final set of episodes arrived, bringing the show's total output to just a dozen installments. By the time filming wrapped on that final batch, the marriage between the two creators had quietly ended. There was no public spectacle, no dramatic fallout captured by tabloids, simply two creative partners who had grown apart personally while remaining remarkably professional in their work together. Watching the finished episodes, it is genuinely difficult to tell that the real-life relationship behind the fictional bickering had already dissolved. Whatever tension existed between them off-camera never bled into the quality of what they produced on screen. Of the 12 episodes that make up the entire series, one stands apart from the rest, not because it is necessarily the funniest, though many longtime fans would argue it is, but because it remains the single most argued over piece of comedy the show ever produced. It begins with the hotel's frantic owner suffering a blow to the head, leaving him disoriented and barely able to function, as if his ordinary state of barely controlled panic were not already precarious enough. Add a concussion into the mix, and the results are predictably disastrous. A group of German tourists arrive to check into the hotel, and in his addled state, the owner becomes fixated on the idea that he must avoid causing any offense whatsoever. He issues a firm, almost frantic instruction to his staff, insisting that under no circumstances should anyone bring up the war. Naturally, given the character's established inability to follow his own advice, he proceeds to do exactly the opposite within moments. What follows is an escalating spiral of increasingly inappropriate references to the Second World War, culminating in an exaggerated impression of a notorious historical dictator, complete with a mocking march through the hotel lobby in front of horrified guests. The sequence is undeniably shocking even decades later. It pushes the boundaries of taste about as far as a mainstream sitcom of that era dared to go, and reactions at the time were sharply divided. Many viewers understood immediately what the writers were actually doing. The joke was never aimed at the German guests themselves, nor was it intended to trivialize the horrors of the war. The true target was the hotel owner's own ignorance, his desperate insecurity, and his complete inability to read a room even when he was trying his hardest not to cause offense. His failure was the punchline, not the war itself. Not everyone saw it that way, though. Letters poured into network offices from viewers who felt the episode had crossed a line, arguing that it trivialized a genuinely painful chapter of history for the sake of cheap laughs. Some accused the show of poor taste, and a portion of the audience called for the episode to be pulled from circulation entirely. Network executives found themselves in the middle of a heated internal debate about whether to allow the episode to remain part of the broadcast rotation. In the end, they chose not to remove it, but the argument over whether that was the right call has never fully gone away. Audience reaction abroad added another layer of complexity to the controversy. Among viewers in Germany itself, opinions were far from unanimous. Some appreciated that the satire was clearly pointed at British attitudes and British self-absorption regarding the war rather than at Germans as a people, and found genuine humor in watching the hotel owner make an absolute fool of himself. Others, particularly those with personal or family connections to wartime suffering, found the comedic treatment of such subject matter genuinely painful rather than funny, regardless of where the satirical target was supposedly aimed. For decades, that particular episode remained a fixture of the show's legacy, frequently cited by fans as a prime example of the series at its most audacious. But as streaming platforms began archiving decades of older television and audiences began revisiting classic comedy through a modern lens, the episode found itself under fresh scrutiny. Content that once aired without significant edit began facing. Several streaming services eventually made the decision to either remove the episode from their libraries entirely or trim specific lines and moments they deemed too risky for a modern audience. This sparked an entirely new wave of controversy, this time centered not on the original content itself, but on the ethics of editing decades-old comedy to fit contemporary standards. Longtime fans of the show pushed back hard against these changes, arguing that selectively editing or removing the episode fundamentally misunderstood its comedic intent. To them, the entire point of the character at the center of the show was that he was consistently, spectacularly wrong about everything. Removing the evidence of his worst moment, they argued, was less an act of sensitivity and more a form of historical revisionism that robbed the joke of its actual meaning. The show's original writer, never one to shy away from a public argument, weighed in directly on the controversy. He defended the episode passionately, insisting that satire is not obligated to make everyone comfortable and that the entire joke had always been about British obsession with the war and about the lead character's own stupidity, never about mocking an entire nation. According to him, the hotel owner was never meant to be admired or excused. He was petty, snobbish, and consistently clueless, and the comedy came specifically from watching his schemes collapse in on themselves every single time. In this particular case, his desperate attempt to avoid giving offense produced one of the most spectacularly offensive outcomes imaginable, which was, in the writer's view, exactly the point. That defense captures something essential about why the episode continues to spark disagreement even now. Comedy that walks close to a genuinely painful subject will always divide an audience, because what one viewer interprets as pointed satire, another may experience as simple cruelty dressed up in cleverness. When the subject matter involves something as heavy as a world war, the margin for error narrows considerably, and reasonable people can watch the exact same scene and come away with completely opposite conclusions about its value. Despite, or perhaps because of, all that ongoing debate, the episode has never faded from public memory. If anything, the controversy cemented its place in television history rather than diminishing it. The lead character's frantic insistence on avoiding a topic he then proceeds to bring up constantly has become one of the most quoted, referenced, and parodied moments in the history of British comedy. Even people who have never watched a full episode of the series often recognize the phrase and understand roughly what it refers to. Few single scenes from any sitcom have managed to remain this culturally relevant for this long, continuing to generate fresh debate decades after it first aired. While audiences were laughing and arguing about what appeared on screen, the environment behind the scenes carried its own quiet drama. The two creative partners at the heart of the show continued working together professionally even after their personal relationship had ended, maintaining a level of collaboration that never visibly cracked under the strain. Watching their characters bicker, scheme, and problem solve together on screen, it would be nearly impossible for an outside observer to guess that the real people behind those roles had already parted ways in their personal lives. The actress who played the hotel owner's formidable wife brought a very different energy to set than her character suggested. Off-screen, she was known as warm and thoughtful, a striking contrast to the sharp, commanding presence she projected on camera. She has spoken about drawing inspiration for the role from real women she had observed who could silence an entire room with nothing more than a raised eyebrow and a perfectly timed comment. That contrast between the performer and the performance speaks to just how carefully constructed the show's comedy actually was, built by people who understood precisely how to weaponize a character trait for maximum comedic effect. The actor who played the endlessly confused foreign waiter gave one of the most physically demanding performances of the entire series, often at real personal cost. In one particularly memorable scene, involving a frying pan, the first take reportedly used an actual metal pan rather than a prop, leaving the actor with a genuine bruise before the production switched to a safer rubber substitute. He also suffered minor burns during a scene involving fire that did not go entirely according to plan. Through it all, by most accounts, he never complained, returning to set again and again with remarkable good humor, ultimately turning his character into one of the most beloved and most physically abused figures in television comedy history. None of these behind-the-scenes struggles ever diminished what ended up on screen. If anything, the strange mixture of personal tension and professional dedication seemed to sharpen the show's edge rather than dull it. There is something almost poetic about a show built entirely around a man desperately trying to project competence, while everything around him fell apart, being produced by a cast and crew who managed to do the exact opposite in real life, holding everything together even as personal circumstances grew complicated. After the series concluded, its central star did not slow down. He went on to build an expansive career spanning film, television, and voice work, becoming a recognizable presence in projects loved by entirely new generations who may never have seen the original hotel comedy that made him famous. He has remained famously outspoken well into his later years, unafraid to weigh in publicly on debates about comedy, culture, and creative freedom. More recently, he has explored the idea of revisiting the world of the hotel comedy in a new form, collaborating this time with a member of his own family. Though reactions to that prospect have been mixed among longtime fans, wary of tampering with something they consider untouchable. His former creative and romantic partner took a dramatically different path after the show ended. Rather than continuing to chase the spotlight, she stepped back from acting almost entirely and pursued a career in psychotherapy, trading public performance for private practice. It was a surprising turn for someone who had been so central to crafting one of the most acclaimed comedies in television history.